interesting is that the exact same procedures that allow her to only hit the white balls are the same procedures that allow you to select the language you need to be speaking right now. So to sum that all up, language use changes, language representations change because joint activation leads to conflict, which requires selection. That's the whole story about bilingualism and neuroplasticity, okay? So let's look at the consequences. I'm going to focus on the linguistic consequences today. So we know some things about bilinguals and language use, and on the face of it, they sound kind of negative, but I'm going to argue that they're not at all negative. So bear with me while I lay out what seems to be not great news. We know that bilinguals have more trouble generating words than monolinguals. I'm going to talk more about this in a few minutes in the context of verbal fluency tasks. It takes longer for a bilingual to generate a specific word. Well, of course, because first you need milliseconds, but it's measurable time to select the appropriate language. We also know that if you give monolinguals and bilinguals vocabulary tests in one language, typically the monolinguals will have higher vocabularies. Here's an illustration. This is data from a study we published some years ago. We had 1,700 and some odd children and just a little bit fewer adults do an English vocabulary test. These are all standardized scores, so the age doesn't matter because the vocabulary score, this is the PPVT, is adjusted for age. Bilinguals are in blue, monolinguals in red, and that's going to be the case for my whole talk. These are distributions, and so this is the different scores you can get. 100 is the population mean for the test, and these are frequencies. So what you'll see, even if you don't read the details, what you see is normal distributions. Any test you give to a population should produce a normal distribution. And what these data are telling you is the vocabulary scores are normally distributed. That's really important. But what you can also see is that the red curve is flipped a little bit, shifted a little bit to the right where the scores are higher. So that means monolinguals and bilinguals have normally distributed vocabularies, but on average, monolinguals score a little higher. And we can collapse those into one graph because, as I said, age doesn't matter. So is this bad news? You could say, well, we have to worry here because bilinguals don't know enough words. And what I'm going to say is absolutely not. Here's the curve. This is just the curve from the children that I showed you a minute ago. Now, the population mean of this test is 100. And what you have is that the monolingual mean is a little bit higher and the bilingual mean is a little bit lower. Keep in mind, these are normal distributions. So on the basis of this, and this is a ton of data, right? These are thousands of participants. Can we say that monolinguals know more vocabulary than bilinguals? Well, here are the monolinguals for whom that is true. Here are the bilinguals for whom that is true. That's less than half the curve. For the majority of real estate on these graphs, we have everybody in the middle, in the green section, where you cannot predict if the difference will favor a monolingual or a bilingual. And that's really important because statements that are true on average are not necessarily true of individuals. So we can have within that green section, many, many bilinguals with better vocabulary in English than monolinguals. And this doesn't even touch the vocabulary they may also have in their other language. I want to look at that in more detail with children and try to persuade you that these vocabulary scores are not very important. I'm just going to skip through this. When we measure vocabulary on a test like that, we're giving kids a very formal test where we ask them item by item, do you know this word? Do you know this word? But you can also get a sense of their vocabulary in a more realistic, communicative, meaningful setting. So what we wanted to do here is compare the assessments of their language ability using these kinds of formal tests versus meaningful informal assessments, because that's really what matters more. And we evaluated the quality of their explanations and the quality of their narratives. We did this with 50 kids in kindergarten who were about 5 years old. Half of them were bilingual. So they're the same age, or their parents have the same amount of education, and they have the same nonverbal IQ. Here's what we did. We gave them formal measures, that same PPVT vocabulary score, a formal morphology test, and a test of syntax. And what we found is that on all of these formal measures, the monolinguals got significantly higher scores, just as we found with the PPVT scores. But then we took these same kids and we just asked them to talk. And we had them explain things, tell stories, and so on, and looked at the same kinds of measures. How many different words were they able to use? What was their morphology? How good was their morphology, their syntax, and so on. And here, in terms of their conversational uses of language, the only real hit for the bilingual kids was they made more morphological errors. These are things like past tense and plurals and stuff. Everything else was fine. They were using language just as well as the monolingual kids. And then we gave them a set of items. We said, these are magnets, tell us what you're doing. Here's a wordless picture book, tell us the story. And on those measures, there were absolutely no differences. Their narratives for the monolingual and bilingual children were every bit as rich, and their explanations were every bit as good. So sure, they have smaller vocabulary, but they're doing just fine. Verbal fluency tests are a really important standard assessment for language proficiency and language use. And these are used it's part of a standard neuropsychological assessment. So if you fall off your motorcycle and land in the hospital, somebody will give you a verbal fluency task. It's a really sensitive measure of brain function. There's two versions of verbal fluency. The first one is semantic fluency, where you have to name all the things that belong to a particular category. Name all the vegetables, name all the vehicles, name all the occupations. That's just a vocabulary test. And so we expect, because it's just a vocabulary test, that bilinguals should produce fewer words than monolinguals. The other form of the test is phonological fluency. And in this form, you have to produce all the words that begin with a particular letter, all the words that you can think of that start with F or M or S. Now, that isn't how your lexical knowledge is represented. So this version tests both vocabulary and cognitive control. Now, cognitive control or executive control is one of the things we believe bilinguals are better at. So bilinguals should overcome their deficit on phonological fluency tasks. So this is just to illustrate the predictions. Yeah, monolinguals and bilinguals. On a semantic fluency task, Bilinguals know fewer words, so they should do more poorly than monolinguals. But on phonological fluency, bilinguals have better executive control, so they should overcome that, that disadvantage. So you see the predictions. On semantic fluency, monolinguals should do better than bilinguals. On phonological fluency, they should do similarly. And this is what we find. We have, semantic fluency, here I'm calling them category and letter, but it's semantic and phonological. Monolinguals produce more words than bilinguals. These are young adults, but on phonological fluency, they're equivalent. So that's just confirming the prediction. I'm skipping over this because I've got way too much. So what happens when you do this with children? Well, we did fluency tasks with 7-year-old and 10-year-old children, and we gave them both semantic and phonological fluency. And here's what happens with children. These are hard tests. First, you can see all of these bars are pretty low. These children in 1 minute are only producing on average about 7 words, which is pretty limited when they're 7. For the 7-year-olds, there are absolutely no differences. So even though these 7-year-old bilingual children have poorer vocabulary in English than the monolingual kids, when you give them a more difficult language processing task, they're all struggling and they're all doing the same. Nobody's really doing very well. 10-year-olds are starting to get it. And here's where this typical pattern is beginning to emerge. So by 10 years old, we have this pattern I showed you before, where the monolinguals are now outperforming the bilinguals with no difference for phonological fluency. So you see this pattern by 10. You don't see it in younger children because the task is still too hard for everybody. I'm trying to make a distinction here between simple measures of vocabulary and more complex measures of what you can do with the vocabulary. So what can we say then about language and bilingualism? There are, in fact, differences between monolinguals and bilinguals in vocabulary size, but there isn't compelling evidence that these vocabulary differences add up to differences in proficiency in language use. So the use of language in terms of meaningful communication and controlled access, generally not very different from monolinguals. And then there is, of course, the possibility that language processing that also recruits executive control might be enhanced in bilinguals on phonological fluency. And here with the evidence there is simply that they closed the gap. All right, so how are children learning these languages? The studies that I've shown you so far, the data that I've shown you so far, have compared children who are growing up monolingual in homes where they only speak one language to children who are growing up with 2 languages. So these are children who are bilingual from the home, and they get to school, and English is the language for everybody, but the bilingual children also have some other language that they're using at home. But some children become bilingual in school through bilingual education. Sometimes it's through foreign language instruction, but sometimes it's through a more immersive or intense program of bilingual education. Bilingual education really is an umbrella term. It doesn't denote a particular kind of educational program, but it includes any educational program where either there's a mismatch between the school language and the community language, the school language and the home language, or even two instructional languages in schools. They're all kind of included. So if we look at that kind of umbrella set of programs, what can we say about children who are becoming bilingual or learning language in these educational settings, as opposed to being bilingual and then showing up at school and being participants in our experiments? Well, in North America, we can talk about a variety of configurations of bilingual education that have different programs, and this is only a small sampling. In the United States especially, there's a lot of flavors here. And I just want to look at a few of them. So we can say in bilingualism, where children speak something at home and then come to school where English is spoken, and forgive me, this is all based on English, but any language can be substituted. So this is heritage language bilingualism, and this is the majority of the research that we do, certainly the research I've already shown you. Children speak something at home and they speak English at school. In Canada, we have French immersion programs where children speak English at home. The community language is English, but when they go to school, they only hear French. And then in the United States, there's a great variety of programs, but I'll just say dual language education as a kind of a catch-all. Typically, these kids speak Spanish at home, and they go to school, and there's English and or Spanish at school. Some combination, sometimes there's a transition. Now, in all these programs, the majority language is English, which is to say the language of the community is English in all cases. So what kind of English proficiency do these kids have? Well, if they speak something else at home, they may well be ESL, English as a second language. They're just learning English, gaining proficiency in English. In French immersion, their English is very high. They speak English at home. It's the language of the community. And in the United States, in these dual language programs, English proficiency is typically low. More importantly, we can look at other at-risk factors that these kids bring to school. Heritage language kids who are becoming bilingual at home and learning English, no particular risk factors. They're just learning English. French immersion, no risk factors at all. And in the United States, dual language programs, many risk factors. These kids tend to be lower socioeconomic status, they tend to have academic challenges and so on. So you can see that there's a lot of stuff going on if we even just want to know how they're managing in learning language. So to make it possible to even ask the question, we're only going to focus at that one middle band, the French immersion case in Canada, where kids come to school to learn French. They have excellent English, they have no other risk factors. It's kind of the best of all worlds. French immersion in and became massively popular. There are waiting lists for these programs. There's a kind of an interest in Canadian children learning French, which is an official language, but the minority language. And so these programs are immensely popular and they've been studied in great detail. And the main results of these programs are as follows. Children who participate in these programs have intact English skills, including literacy skills, even though all of their reading instruction is only in French. They read English as well as kids in English-only programs. Their French skills are okay. They're not native. And their academic achievement is fine. So this is a very tempting alternative for parents as a way of teaching French because there seems to be no real downside. Here's some data from a study we published about 10 years ago. We went into French immersion classes and we studied kids who were in 2nd and 5th grade. So they were 7 years old and 10 years old. These are Anglophone children learning French in French immersion. All of their school instruction is in French. And we want to know, so how is their French? So we gave them language tests in both English and French, just to get a sense of how their French was doing. So here's receptive vocabulary tests. Now these scores are standardized for age, so we don't expect the age, grade 2 versus grade 5, to make a difference because their score is calibrated to their age. So how are they doing? These kids speak English at home, they speak English at soccer practice, but they speak only French at school. Well, as you can see, their English scores are way higher than their French scores. That's okay, not so surprising. Their French scores are okay, but nowhere near their English scores. And what about verbal fluency? So these are the tests that I showed you. And I just collapsed across semantic fluency and phonological fluency. Now here you see that from grade 2 and grade 5, the lines go up. That's because these aren't standard scores, these are raw scores. So we expect the 10-year-olds to come up with more words. But again, they're doing substantially better in English, which I've drawn in red, than they are in French. Okay? So their French is okay, but it doesn't make, it's not as good as their English. And what we can see even here is that just like bilingualism, bilingual education is also associated with lower formal vocabulary scores. Now, French immersion is interesting. I told you how popular it is. And all of those studies that evaluated its effectiveness were done a long time ago. But since those studies, two things have changed. Two really important things have changed. The first is demographic. In the original studies, pretty well all the children in French immersion were middle-class monolingual Anglophones, like almost exclusively. And those are kids who do well in school anyway. Currently, everybody wants in on French immersion. I told you how popular it is. And so the children in French immersion now are diverse. They're not necessarily middle-class monolingual Anglophone. They represent the full spectrum of demographic diversity that we have here. So we want to know, are the results going to be the same as the original studies for those homogeneous groups? And the second thing that's changed since the original study is that we now know that bilingualism also impacts cognition. Nobody knew that in the 1970s when those evaluation studies were first conducted. So we can also ask, does French immersion in itself promote those kinds of changes that we see with bilingualism? And now on this slide, I'm going to give you a brief detour to give you a piece of the argument that you'll need in a couple of minutes. The number one factor that affects children's development profoundly is socioeconomic status. On any measure you can think of, children of lower SES are going to struggle more than children of higher SES. And we see it in both verbal and nonverbal performance. There's a few studies that have looked independently at the effects of SES and the effects of bilingualism, because they often pull in different directions. So I'll just show you data from one of our studies, but there's other studies that have shown the same thing. These bars are standard deviations, they're not scores. And that means that they're based on the assumption of, all the kids in the study are considered to have 0. So how much better or worse than everybody else in the study are they doing? So bars below the line is worse than average. Bars above the line are better than average. That's how you read the standard deviation data. These are standardized scores. So we gave all of these kids who are monolingual or bilingual and middle SES or somewhat lower SES a bunch of executive function tasks. And here the red bars for both the middle SES and lower SES, the red bars go down. That means they're doing poorer on average. And the blue bars go up. So the bilingual kids are doing better on average for both middle class and lower class. And if we look at the language measures, the bars flip. Now, again, the middle class ones are here. These are higher SES, and these are lower SES. Higher is always higher than lower, but now you see it's the blue lines that go down. What this graph tells you is that regardless of SES, bilinguals are doing better on executive function tasks, and monolinguals are doing better on language tasks, regardless of SES. But if you have a large enough sample and a big enough range of SES, you find really interesting interactions. So this is a study based on over 18,000 kids who were monolingual in red or bilingual in blue, and covered a full range of very low to very high SES. And there's two things you need to see on this graph. One is the blue line is always higher than the red line. The bilinguals are always doing better on the executive function tasks. But the interaction effect is that the gap is greatest at the lowest levels of SES. Okay, so there's a greater deficit for monolingual children in the lower SES groups. So we have to think about SES. So that was the brief detour, and I want to come back now to the French immersion study that we developed to address those two issues that apply to modern programs. Our questions were this: to what extent do children in French immersion become bilingual? To what extent do children in French immersion show cognitive benefits? And to what extent do these effects apply to children across SES backgrounds? We did this as a longitudinal study. We started testing children in first grade when they were 6. And every year we gave them language and cognitive tests. And we analyzed the data both continuously and by groups. So here's who we started with. We had 234 children, and we knew a lot about these children. We divided them into middle SES and high SES based on parents' education. I need to point out, none of these kids are really low SES. 3 here means high school diploma. 4+ means professional or graduate education. So these are very small differences. And yet they cluster into these groups that we call middle and high SES. These are estimates of their income. You can see the higher SES are making more money. Within each SES, we have bilingualism based on their language at home. Now remember, this is French immersion. They're going to learn French. So kids who speak something else at home are learning French as a third language. Kids who speak nothing else at home except English are learning French as a second language. IQ scores are the same. PPVT scores show the usual effect. The monolinguals are higher in both groups, and so on. Okay, that's who we had. Here's what happened over the 3 years. When we went back in year 2, we lost 17% of the kids because of various things. When we went back in year 3, we lost almost half of the kids. Why? Because we were testing in March 2020. So we got halfway through testing and had to shut down. All right, what did we find? Let's start with their English vocabulary. We tested them in the first year for their English vocabulary scores, and I'm showing you the data for middle versus high, monolingual versus bilingual. These were the standard PPVT scores, and this is exactly in line with what I showed you before with that larger sample. Monolinguals in each SES group are scoring higher. In fact, these scores line up exactly with the larger sample. So perfectly expected data. Monolinguals have higher vocabulary in English. Does it matter? So what can they do with the vocabulary? English verbal fluency. Name all the animals you can think of in 60 seconds to test vocabulary. Phonological fluency. Name all the words you can that begin with the letter F or S or whatever. And that measures vocabulary plus executive control. How are they doing? I'm going to show you the results again, plotted as standard scores, standard deviations. So if the bar, remember monolinguals are in red and bilinguals are in blue. If the bar points up, they're doing better than the rest of the group. If the bar points down, they're doing worse than the rest of the group. And this shows you pretty clearly that overall, the bilinguals are not coming up with as many words. It turns out these differences are not very significant, but you can see the pattern, you can see the trends where the monolinguals at 6 years old know more words and they're able to produce more words. Well, what about the more difficult phonological fluency? Remember that I was telling you that when we looked at these results with young adults, monolinguals were producing more words, but when you added this other selection component in phonological fluency, the gap narrowed. And that's what happens here. These differences diminish. So when the task is not only how many words you know, but also can you use your executive control functions to select the correct or the appropriate words, the gaps narrow. And we're seeing this in 6-year-olds, 7-year-olds, and 8-year-olds across these ages for English fluency. So I'd say here that even though the bilinguals have smaller overall vocabularies in English, they're doing pretty well with them. There's not a big deficit. Well, how are they doing with French? All the kids show up in the first year of this program knowing no French. None of the kids know any French. And now we want to see how their French acquisition goes as a function of whether they're monolingual or bilingual. So is French their second language, as the case for the monolingual kids, or is it their third language, as is the case for the bilingual kids? When they're 6 years old, they don't have very much French yet, and they're all exactly the same. Notice here, though, this is a significant and really interesting difference. The higher SES kids, right off the bat, are learning more French, right away. Now, there's no difference between monolinguals and bilinguals. But if their parents are more educated, they're learning more French. It's a curiosity, and I would like to know more about that. Similar results in year 2, but look at year 3. The blue bars are shooting up. So by the time they're in the 3rd year of the program and they're 8 years old, the bilingual kids are in fact learning more French. They're advancing better. Here's another way of showing the same data. I've stacked this. So the bottom bit is their 1st year scores. The middle bit is their improvement to their 2nd year scores. And the cap is their improvement to the 3rd year. So if you just compare the size of the caps, you can see that in both the middle SCS and the high SCS groups, the bilingual kids have bigger caps. They're suddenly spurting ahead. They figured it out. There's another way of presenting these data, and that is to not divide the kids in terms of groups, not call them monolingual or bilingual or high SCS or middle SCS. All of the kids also have a score showing how much bilingual experience they are. Even the monolingual kids have some kind of bilingual experience. So instead of showing you the data in terms of groups, I'm going to show you the entire sample as a function of how bilingual they are. What are their French vocabulary scores? So we have 1st year, 2nd year, 3rd year. These are their bilingualism scores. The further to the right, the more bilingual the kids. And these are their French vocabulary scores. And what you can see is all 3 lines have a positive slope, showing the more bilingual they are, the more French they're learning. And that slope is even significant in the 1st year when there are really no other visible differences if you just look at the groups. Being more bilingual is associated with better progress in learning this new language right from the beginning. And very quickly here, we also gave them French verbal fluency tests. And now you're seeing a lot more blue. The blue lines are kind of popping up. And again, they're not doing very well here. The actual scores are pretty poor. But if you just look at which is popping up, blue or red, you can see that regardless of the vocabulary, the bilingual kids are doing pretty well. By the 3rd year, there's just absolutely no difference in phonological fluency. The monolingual kids here are not quite getting it. So what can we conclude? We know that both bilingualism and socioeconomic status and their interaction impact children's outcomes. Children, indeed, even in this study, bilingual children had lower English vocabulary scores. I showed you those data as well. They have lower PBVT scores, but it doesn't seem to matter. It shows them having somewhat lower semantic fluency scores because that's just a vocabulary test, but no difference in phonological fluency. The SCS differences was always a factor, and curiously, the SCS differences in this study, in this sample, are really small. We're only talking about kids whose parents either just have high school degrees or have graduate or professional degrees. These kids are not living in poverty. These kids don't have all kinds of risk factors. It's a pretty minor difference, but it had a significant and persistent impact on the results. But most importantly, I think, throughout all the years, the bilingual children are making better progress in French. And on that regression line that I just showed you, that regression line is significant even in year 1. But by 3rd year, it's very clear that the bilingual children are outperforming the monolinguals in French vocabulary. But again, just to restate what I've been trying to stress, you can't overinterpret vocabulary scores. The real measure of language proficiency has to be made in the context of processing. What can you do with your vocabulary? How selective can you be with your vocabulary? And there, bilingualism begins to be a factor. Now, I just want to conclude and throw in one other aspect of this study. I told you we gave them cognitive tests every year. And so I just want to show you the results of one of the cognitive tasks we gave them in year 1 when they were 6 years old. Gave them this nonverbal Simon picture task, a conflict task. They see a picture and they get a rule. If you see a cloud, press the button on the left. If you see a sun, press the button on the right. And then these suns and clouds can appear either in the middle, so there's no conflict, or on the sides where there could be, because the cloud can be congruent with the correct key or incongruent. This is a task we've used in the past. We published these results some time ago. In the center condition, where they just have to learn the rule, monolinguals and bilinguals performed equivalently. But on the side condition, where you had to resolve the conflict between the position of the correct key and the position of the stimulus, these are reaction times, so higher scores are poorer, lower scores are better. The bilinguals were faster and better. So we thought we would just try this out with our grade 1 sample. So these are the 234 kids that I showed you before. And in the center condition, and now we're separating them by middle SES and high SES, there's no difference. These are not significant differences. You may have noticed that 1200 milliseconds was how long it took in that first previously published studies. It's exactly the same. What about the side conditions where there's conflict? And here's where it's interesting. In this condition, for the middle, which is our lower SES, none of these are different from each other. But for the higher SES kids, the bilinguals are suddenly way better. And they're better for both congruent and incongruent trials. They're faster. They can resolve the conflict more efficiently. So what we showed here is that in this group of 6-year-olds, the bilingual children in the high SES group outperformed the monolingual, as we had shown in our previous study, and that it interacted with SES because we didn't find the effect in the lower middle SES group. All right, what can we say about language acquisition and bilingualism? Well, I've shown you several times that on average, bilingual children know fewer words in each language, but there's very little evidence that this leads to a deficit in processing. Children who are becoming bilingual through education, for example, in French immersion, remain dominant in their home language. French immersion doesn't make you native-like, it just doesn't. But children in French immersion who already know another language, these are the bilingual kids learning French as a third language, seem to have an advantage in learning that new language. And this is, for me, the biggest puzzle. We're trying to understand this. All of the children were broadly speaking middle class, but the small differences in middle class in terms of parents' education had significant effects on both language and cognitive outcomes. We need to pay a lot more attention to children's home language background, social background, and cognitive stimulation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ellen. That was so interesting, and so many data that you presented and so many studies that you have done. It's really, just fantastic. And we can all learn so many results, outcomes from your study. Now I would give, of course, the floor, the mic to my colleagues, and please welcome to either comment or ask a question, or maybe relate to the studies that Helen has presented. Anybody? Okay, then I'll break the ice. Okay, try to be the icebreaker. Whenever, for example, I talk about this, language acquisition, and especially second language acquisition with my students, and I also present, especially, the outcomes of your studies that monolingual children do know more words than others. I keep wondering whether, measuring vocabulary in the way that you measure the time of how fast you can produce different words, right? Is this really, the right way? Because actually you did say that these children still can, the bilingual children can use all these words that they cannot produce so fast, then, in the situations. But I think that the message that we get across to our, listeners, or let's say lay people, out there, is that, there is this deficit, there is this something, to worry about. Have you been maybe thinking, does this matter so much, or can we, I don't know, also reflect on these results in a different way, or present them in a different way? I don't know. That has been just kind of, a bee in my.
Okay, I'd like to make a couple of comments on that. It's a very important issue, and I did try to stress it throughout the talk, but I didn't give any hint of how I would resolve it, which is what you're asking. So I want to say two things. One, I'm going to be very brief, and that is, one simple response is that in terms of research, when we give these instruments as tests and then we make conclusions about research, what I'm suggesting is we should be careful not to overinterpret the results of these very specific formal tests, because they don't mean that these kids are linguistically ignorant. They just mean they got a different score on that test. So as researchers, we have to be really careful about our conclusions. But the much more important point, the far more important point, is in testing and assessment. And this is a huge issue, because certainly in the United States, kids are shoved off for all sorts of educational testing, and the speech language therapist, the clinical psychologist, the teacher, whoever is doing it, pulls all these standard tests out of the bag and gives it to the kids and says, oh, look, you scored lower than the population average. My. And this is a huge problem, because what is needed is testing norms and assessments that are appropriate and standardized to bilingual children. There are people in the US who've been working on this problem, a wonderful group, Liz Penna in California is one of them, who are trying to create a set of instruments that are appropriate for bilingual children, in this case, Spanish. In the US, it's just all Spanish. It's really all they think about. But start somewhere, that's okay. So what would the norms on a, say, PPV-T be if you speak Spanish at home? Because if you don't know what those norms are, you can't interpret how this kid who was referred for testing is actually doing. So it's an incredibly important problem, and it's going to require much more intense research and development to come up with norms and assessments that can actually convey how is this kid doing for somebody who speaks Spanish at home, or for somebody who speaks Italian at home, or for somebody who speaks whatever at home. Because if you don't know that, you can't interpret these scores. I think it's a very big issue, and there's a long way to go yet.
Absolutely agree. Yeah, especially I think this multilingual testing or assessment is really, I think, just appearing, and whenever we talk about, I mean, that a child can come up, I mean, that he does know the word, let's say, of an animal, but not in the language that she is tested in. So is this a problem, you know, or is just, you know, the word that comes up, and for the child, I think the content matters, you know, the language does not matter as much as it does.
That's exactly. So you saw that in the interest of time, I skipped over some slides, and there's one that I skipped over that I want to just describe in the context of what you just said. In that big study with, you know, 1,600 kids or whatever it was, we took a subset of the kids. They happened to be kids who were 6 years old. And instead of just plotting their standard scores, we took every item on the test and made a decision about whether this was a word that you would have learned and used at home, like referring to foods or cooking items or, you know, home routines, or is it a word you would have more likely learned at school, like, you know, rectangle, astronaut, stuff like that. And we put them into these two categories, and then we just compared absolute scores. How many of these home items did monolingual kids and bilingual kids get right in English? And how many of these school items did monolingual and bilingual kids get right in English? And the results were really clear. For home items, you know, spatula, cooking sheet, whatever, in English, the monolingual kids had significantly higher scores because they do that at home in English. For school items, things that they would have learned in the context of sitting in class, no difference. So there's nothing wrong with their English. They don't know how to say spatula in English because they know how to say it in Portuguese or Serbo or Croatian or whatever. There's nothing wrong with their vocabularies. And so, you know, I think just to go back to your previous point, I think there's something wrong with our tests, and we have to be really careful about what we conclude. But in the meantime, the tests are what we have, and they do give us information that we need in order to understand the language abilities of these children.
I think I have been just thinking about, you know, one kind of statement by somebody who was quite a lot involved in bilingualism, Hugo de Batins from Brussels, and he said that well, that nowadays, whether we like it or not, monolingualism is still the norm. So it's still what we take as normal, I think. And that's why I think it's such a long way to, you know, to accept multilingual testing or assessment or multilingual answers and things like that. So, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah. So anybody else? Maybe Silva might have a question, my colleague from University of Gostja. Yeah.
All right. Yes, thank you very much for this really inspiring talk and also inspiring research, in fact, I think. I was really wondering, given that these results are really encouraging, the ones, you know, on bilingualism and on bilingual education, how do you have any information or any experience maybe about how all these results are, how are they accepted or how are they received outside the academic community now that we have all this? So what do we do now? I mean, can we influence school practice or school policies with I mean, do you have any experience about this?
Yeah, my experience with this is all depressing. So, I would love to be asked my opinion on education policy and social policy and language policy, but mostly nobody asks. And I had one really awful experience with this high-level think tank in the US where they asked and they said, oh, no, that can't be right. And then it was just utterly, tossed out. So it's a problem.
Yes, because I think also in our project,
I leave it for others. I mean, I think it's really important. I would love for what we've learned from research to actually be used in forming policy. And I have not been able to do that.
But you mentioned also that there's you saw an increase in the interest in French immersion classes, right? There's an increase in that. So is there a I don't know, a perception that in fact it's a good idea to be bilingual behind this increase, or what do you think the reason could be for that?
Well, I think it's there's a lot of reasons, and some of them are very specific to French immersion. So let me just say, first of all, French immersion is offered in public schools, which means they're free in your neighborhood school if your school has this program. And a lot of parents consider it to be some kind of what do you call it? Not gifted program, but enhanced program, like a gifted program, right? Because you're going to learn more. So that's one thing. So parents, it's a more elite program. So there's a status involved. Another thing is Canada is officially bilingual, and there are advantages to knowing French. There are job opportunities if you're fully bilingual. So there's practical concerns, and parents want their children to learn French. So in Canada, all Anglophone schools are required to teach French as a foreign language, and Francophone schools are required to teach English. But as you can imagine, those programs are pretty pathetic, and kids sort of sleepwalk through them and learn almost nothing. So parents realize it's a better guarantee for French. So I mean, there's a lot of reasons that these programs are popular, and they may not always be of the most honorable variety.
Yeah, thank you. I think we see something like that also in Slovenia, especially in the area where I come from, which is a bilingual area, Slovene-Italian bilingual area. And we've seen now an increase in the interest of Italian schools teaching Slovene, which was impossible in the past. This was something unthinkable, in fact, in the past. But now we've seen that, and we like to believe that it may be also due to some, let's say, perception of the advantages of being bilingual. But maybe we're wrong. Maybe there are other reasons, but at least partly.
Yeah, absolutely. Silva is right. Bronka, would you like to ask a question? Yeah, that's my colleague from the Ministry of Education, who is our kind of power, at the decision maker side, which happens rarely, but it does happen.
Thank you, Carmen, and thank you very much for this talk. You said that you would like to be asked about questions about what to change and how to do. As the representative of the ministry, I'm interested to know in which direction your recommendations would go, either, for example, the structure of programs, or the role of languages, or didactical approaches. What would you recommend, for example, on the basis of your research?
Okay, so first I have to say that the specifics of your question concerning structure of the program, didactic approaches, that's a separate field of study in which I am not competent. So language pedagogy, second language, foreign language pedagogy is a field, and there are experts who study that, but I am not one. What I would say is that educational policy, ministries of education. I think the main thing, the number one thing, is to highlight and advance the importance of language. There has been a worldwide shift in the last 10 years, most notably in Britain, but also in the United States, away from offering foreign languages in school. These are considered to be frivolous, not as important as math and engineering, who needs it anyway? And there's been dramatic decrease in the opportunities even to follow a foreign language. So it's a simple thing to say, as part of a curriculum, you don't graduate from high school unless you've done some amount of foreign language instruction. And you can, structure it any way you want, but you have to say that's part of the high school diploma. You're not really an educated high school graduate without ever encountering some decent amount of foreign language education. So I think that I'm not going to specify anything about how or how much or in what form, but get languages back on the agenda and say it's every bit as important as reading and mathematics and chemistry. And it's urgent because there's been immense slippage in the past 10 years, immense slippage. And so that I think that has to be corrected. And with foreign languages, I mean, the other aspect, and we haven't talked about this, but it opens your minds to other ways of thinking, other cultures. If you're learning another language, you're learning that there are other people in the world, and they may, have different ideas about how to think, what kinds of foods to eat, what kinds of, movies to watch. You're opening it up to other cultures, shake people out of their oppressive monolingualism, monoculturalism, which I think is actually a really dangerous point right now in the world. And language is an easy way to do it,
Yeah, thank you. So we are quite lucky here in Slovenia because the one foreign language is compulsory throughout the education, but we are struggling for the second foreign language. I mean, the numbers are becoming smaller, so we would like to promote second foreign language learning. But in your research, you talked about those bilingual students coming from, they were bilingual from home already, and then when they have to learn another language, so the third language, so they did much better than others. So on the basis of this, you can conclude that more languages you speak, easier you learn another language, another additional language, because especially in those bilingual regions here, it's always when we want to introduce a second foreign language, they always shout, oh, they already know, they already speak 3 languages, you cannot force them to learn another one. But then from the practice, we know that they do not have a lot of problems, those kids. But nevertheless, when it's on the policy level discussion, it's always you cannot do more than this. I mean, it's not okay.
People are always underestimating human minds, yes. Especially children's.
I do agree. I do agree. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, absolutely right. Yeah, they tend to, especially decision makers, to underestimate children. And the languages are sometimes treated as burden. I don't know if this but here it does. Yeah. I was wondering, just one maybe more question. When you mentioned bilingual children coming to school and then learning French, how does, let's say, Canada as a country support home languages, or do they support home languages at all?
Yeah, it's not bad. It's really not, and it depends where you are. It's really so it depends where you are. It's very regional. In Quebec, which is francophone, they're not very interested in anything that is in French. So Quebec is a very special case. Toronto, where I live and do my work, is considered the most multicultural city in the world. We have, in a population of something like 4 or 5 million people, about half of the households do not use English as the primary language of the home. And the non-English languages produce a list of something like 200 different languages. So it's massively diverse. And to a surprising, and this is a hard problem, but to a surprisingly good extent, these languages are supported. So I don't know if it still exists, but there used to be heritage language classes in public schools. So if you speak Portuguese at home, you could go after school once a week and learn Portuguese or Italian or Urdu or a number of other languages. I'm not sure if those programs still exist, but the cultural communities support the languages. And that might be even more important, because when you're in neighborhoods that have some critical mass of another language or culture, all the street signs are in that language, the commercial shops put up signs in that language, everybody's fine with that. So I think it's a pretty good level of support. Everything could always be better, but I think it's supported. And I think that that multicultural, non-English speakers, blah, 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 living in this city feel pretty comfortable.
Thank you. There is one thing that we have been planning to do something about it, is that children who come to school with another language and keep it and even, let's say, start to read in their language and develop in their home language, can never show this skill, at school, and actually is never included in their certificates, as another skill. This happens, let's say, in our society. And we have been wondering if, even I think ECML, right, which is European Center for Modern Languages, is now doing something about it. Have you maybe done some work in this area in Canada?
Can you repeat? I didn't follow the question you're asking.
Okay, so for example, I don't know, let's say Toronto is such a multicultural city, yes, and there are children who come to school and they can speak, I don't know, Arabic or
many languages.
Yes. Many languages. Can they show this? So can they show that they really know the language, and can this language skill be included in their final certificate,
Okay, all right, so I'd have to say probably not. Probably not. The problem is that it's so massively diverse that you can't really touch it. So to compare it to the United States, again, the majority of bilingual children in the United States are Hispanic children who have some measure of Spanish at home, some measure of English. And a lot of the research on these issues in the United States has a very simple mechanical thing they can do. You give them a test in English, you give them a test in Spanish, you compare the scores, you know exactly what they know in both languages. You can calculate a ratio to see, you can do all that because you're only dealing with 2 languages or sometimes 3 languages. So we can't do that because where would you get the resources to assess children in these, 100 or 200 other languages? So I'd have to say no, that doesn't exist. There's no formal assessment or acknowledgement of their non-English language skills.
Thank you. There is one question here in chat from one of our colleagues who's a German language teacher living in Slovenia. And she asks, do you have any idea of how to reduce the fear of, so from early foreign language learning? Why is there such a fear of educating kids from the very beginning, from, let's say, preschool age on, and how to raise awareness among the parents?
Okay, so it's an interesting question. Is the fear in the part of the parents, the teachers, or the children? Who has the fear?
I think that Jelka means especially parents, am I right? Or the whole society, parents, yeah, parents.
yeah, I don't know. I mean, I don't know how you get over fear. How do you get over this idea that it's too hard? It isn't too hard. I can assure you kids will be just fine, but it's not too hard. So don't know.
Maybe with lots of, I don't know, good examples, to show good examples. So this is what, I don't know, in my previous, the previous project that I ran together with the Institute of Education, this is what we did. And the teacher said that, let's say at the beginning of the year, what they did, they showed actually also videos and, brought children in. So that they showed, okay, this is not going, so what it was going to be like first, that these are not, let's say, grammar lessons, what parents, let's say, thought could be. And they also showed, what they do, so that it's a lot of playing and things like that. So maybe informing, parents about how you are doing things. So, but there will be always.
I think that would be helpful.
Yeah, I don't know.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Parents are afraid. I mean, that's. I'll just and maybe we can end with this. I'll tell you one anecdote that I think it is on this exact point. So, a very good friend of mine is Israeli, and she has always had a lot of work with the ministry. So, this anecdote happened maybe 30 years ago, 20 or 30 years ago. And because Israel is a small country, everything is centralized. So when the education department puts out a curriculum, it's for the entire country. And they put out a curriculum, I really think this was 30 years ago, and they said, maybe we should introduce English in a more natural immersion sort of way. So why don't we have things like, physical education classes will be conducted in English. It was something like that for little kids, okay? So they'll get used to it, it doesn't matter. Well, parents went ballistic. They went absolutely nuts. They said, oh, it's too hard. How could you do this? You can't do this to our children. This is way too hard. They will struggle, they will fail. Like, come on, we're talking about having phys ed in English, all right? So she was sent out to be the spokesperson to sell this idea to the parents who objected. Now, you have to know that the parents who objected were upper middle class parents in fancy neighborhoods, right? Who were basically, they were all born Israeli. So 30 years ago, you can, do the arithmetic. So she'd go into these school meetings and say, here's the program, you can see it's not scary, and they were really upset. So here's what she would say. She'd say to these parents, so tell me, how many languages do you speak? Well, I speak Hebrew. I'm Israeli, I speak Hebrew. Okay, good. How many languages do your parents speak? Well, my parents, well, I mean, there was, the Holocaust. My parents were born in Europe, so 3. My parents, because they had to, they came. Oh, okay. What about your grandparents? what are you talking about my grandparents? You know, they're 6. So she'd say, get it? No, they didn't get it. They did not get it at all. There was just no ability to think outside of this kind of parochial view of monolingualism. So anyway, that's changed dramatically. Everybody now in Israel speaks excellent English. This was 30 years ago, but the resistance was bizarre, especially since if these people who were complaining had only looked to their own experiences and their own families, they would have seen how silly the objection was.
Thank you much. Thank you very much, yeah, for this anecdote. Sounds very familiar. But yeah, but I think, yeah, that we have done some work now in Slovenia as well at this level. So, and we hope that there are less and less parents who go nuts, you know, when they hear that their child is going to learn another language. Okay, thank you very much. Anybody else would like to add anything? Otherwise, I would really, say my thanks and for this inspiring talk and for all your research, and thank you so much for writing up research and you know, letting us read it and share it and learn from it. And we hope that one day you can come actually to Ljubljana.
I would love to. I mean, I have to say, I've never been there, and I know it's one of the very beautiful places in the world, and I would love that opportunity.
Okay, we will keep this in mind. Okay, save some money, and we would really, yeah, love to have you here and show you around and take you to school so that you can see what's going on, but also to beautiful places. We have the largest cave in Europe and the beautiful, you know, island in the middle of the lake and things like that. So lots of good things to see. So thank you very much. Stay healthy and well, and see you in the future.
Thank you very much.
Yes.
Thank
Bye.
you.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you very much.
Bye.